you very much. Can I welcome everyone here today and thank Port Vale for having us here for the launch of Labour's mission on crime. Every one of us should be able to feel safe on our streets, in our town centres and in our homes. And when things go wrong, we need to know that the police and criminal justice system will be there for us. But too often, after 13 years of Conservative government, and for too many people, that just doesn't happen. We don't see police on the beat, too few crimes are investigated or solved, far fewer criminals are being caught or prosecuted under the Conservatives, serious violence has gone up, and confidence in policing has fallen. And too often people feel that when they need help, no one comes and nothing is done. And last week, I talked to a woman who said she no longer goes shopping in a town centre, doesn't like her kids going into town because she doesn't feel safe because of antisocial behaviour, and she doesn't see police patrols in town anymore. And I've heard the same thing too often. Heard from parents who are worried about their kids because of knife crime or youth violence in their area, and from people who are worried that their elderly parents are being targeted by scams, or for young women sick and tired of having to worry about walking home from the bus stop on their own or about abusive relationships. At the same time, we know the police are overstretched, often picking up the pieces when other services fail, including rising mental health crises, and still struggling with the legacy of austerity and out-of-date technology. So neighbourhood policing too often has been decimated, leaving people feeling frustrated that crimes just aren't being investigated, and it takes too long, even when cases do go to court, with huge long delays. And then this week, we had the truly devastating report on the Metropolitan Police by Louise Casey. Yes, problems that are specific to the Met, but also issues that are very serious for other forces as well. And yet we got nothing from the Conservative Home Secretary this week, literally nothing. No new plan to rebuild confidence, no action to make sure that all forces tackle standards, raise standards and tackle discrimination, or get the police back on the beat or tackle violence against women and girls. Just a shrug of the shoulders. That failure to act is letting down our communities. And it is also undermining the vital work, the incredible work many police officers are doing every day to keep us safe. And most troubling of all, it is a Home Office that is just standing back, as Keir Starmer said this week, a hands-off Home Office that is letting us down. And Labour is clear that we need urgent action to restore confidence in a system that feels broken, including getting police back on the beat, tackling crime, catching criminals, and working together with urgent action to reduce the most serious harms of all, including knife crime and violence against women and girls. And we know that this is not just about the Home Office. That's why Steve Reed is working on plans to speed up the courts and strengthen community justice. Why Emily Thornberry is working to increase prosecutions, lead the fight in tackling fraud. Why Lisa Nandy is working with councils on tackling antisocial behaviour in our town centres. Why Lucy Powell's setting out stronger measures on online crime and abuse. And Bridget Phillipson and Rosanna Allen Khan have set out plans to put mental health professionals in school and to work with young people. With Jess Phillips, Sarah Jones and many others working on action on policing and domestic abuse, and drawing on the work of people like Kim McGuinness, our Northumbria Police and Crime Commissioner, tackling domestic abuse. Because Keir has made clear to us, this is a mission for all of us. And I had my first security briefing more than 25 years ago as a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee. And since then, I've worked with successive Labour Home Secretaries in government and challenged and scrutinised successive Conservative Home Secretaries, as well as police chiefs and other agencies from opposition. And I've campaigned on tackling violence against women and girls for decades. But I have never seen the Home Office more adrift than the Conservative Home Office is now. Never seen it failing so badly showing no leadership as people feel more worried and as confidence in the police and criminal justice system has fallen. They are letting our communities down. And we need huge leadership to turn that around. We need serious commitment to change. And that is what you get from the leader of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer is someone who has spent years really fighting crime, prosecuting criminals and terrorists, supporting victims of crime, fighting for justice, and doing some of the toughest jobs, holding people to account. And that's why he is the right person to lead the fight against crime and for justice, for keeping people safe and for restoring confidence in policing by consent and in the rule of law. It's why he is the right person to lead Britain. Please welcome Keir Starmer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yvette. Thank you, all of you. It's all fantastic to see you all here this morning and to be here in Burslem, the mother town of the potteries, where, where the spades first hit the ground in the construction of the great Trent and Mersey Canal, a fact which, of course, gives its name to Port Vale. Although, for me, if I'm honest, this is better known as the ground where Arsenal came really close to losing the double in 1998. This is true. 2 draws in the cup and a penalty shootout, very close penalty shootout, somewhere just over there. I went out to have a look at the pitch this morning to look at where those penalties were taken from. But look, today we are here on more serious business, as Yvette said, the launch of Labour's second national mission to make our streets safe and stop criminals getting away without punishment. Now, if you think that sounds basic, something which should be guaranteed in a country like ours, then let me tell you, you're right. Nothing is more important, more fundamental to a democracy like ours. The rule of law is the foundation for everything. Margaret Thatcher called it the first duty of government, and she was right about that. An expression of individual liberty, our rights and responsibilities, but also justice, fairness, equality, one rule for all. That's the principle I've been proud to serve all my adult life. As a human rights lawyer, fighting for families with young children, trying to escape mould-infested accommodation, or for freedom of speech in the McLibel case, with the police service of Northern Ireland, advising them how to bring communities together to make the Good Friday Agreement work, and at the Crown Prosecution Service, as the Director of Public Prosecutions, the same principle. Everyone protected, everyone respected, no one denied the law, no one above the law. Not the murderers of Stephen Lawrence, who, for a time, thought that they were. Not Al-Qaeda terrorists. Not MPs, Labour or Conservatives, gaming the expenses system to line their pockets. I prosecuted them all, and I'm proud of that. One rule for all. And that's why I found the pandemic parties in Downing Street under Boris Johnson so reprehensible. The circus of the last few days. A reminder of his total disrespect for a national sacrifice. That's why I said I'd resign if I'd broken those same rules. I just couldn't have looked the British people in the eye and asked them for their trust. Those values are too important to me. The core of my politics today. So if the Tories want to attack me for being a human rights lawyer, attack the values I've stood up for my whole life, I say, fine. That only shows how far they have fallen and how little they understand working people. Because whatever the crime, antisocial behaviour, hate crime, serious violence, it's always working people who pay the heaviest price. Working class communities who have to live under its shadow. That's why tackling crime, law and order will always be important for my Labour Party. Fighting crime is a Labour cause. I grew up working class in a small town. I know how important it is to feel safe in your community. If you don't have a big house and a garden, the streets are where your kids play. Your community is your family, your neighbours, your eyes and ears. You have to feel a sense of trust, of confidence, of security. It's what gives you roots, a precondition of hope, the firm ground you can build your aspirations on. But as somebody who's worked in criminal justice for most of my life, I also know that far too often the inequalities that still scar our society, class, race, gender, do find an expression in the very system that is supposed to protect us all without discrimination. I've talked about this before, but the case that crystallised so much for me was the murder of a nurse called Jane Clough, stabbed to death in the car park of the Blackpool hospital where she worked, killed by the man awaiting trial on multiple charges of raping her on the one morning she went to work unaccompanied. I will never forget the day her parents, John and Penny, came to my office and talked me through the awful treatment they had received from our criminal justice system. It's a moment that has shaped everything I've done since, everything I think about justice, how incomprehensible pain can only be met with practical action. That if you have the power and can do something for the powerless, you've got to roll up your sleeves, work night and day to make the changes, big and small, which can, if not put things right, then at least protect the future. That's what happened that day. As I listened to John and Penny tell me Jane's story, I knew a great injustice had been done. And I made a promise to work with them and make sure no other family would suffer the same fate. So together we changed the guidelines on rape cases in court. And crucially, we forced a change in the law that gave prosecutors the right to appeal against a bail decision. Changes which do give extra protection to women brave enough, like Jane, to place their faith in the system and press charges. But it isn't enough. I know that. In fact, it's why I decided to come into politics. Because the more and more case files I read, the more and more I could see those ugly inequalities at work. You saw it in grooming scandals like Rochdale as well. How good prosecutors and decent police officers, people who hated crime, would end up looking for the perfect victim, casting aspersions based on a way of thinking that was out of date, out of touch with the experience of victims and communities that they needed to serve. Why didn't you go to the police straight away? Why did you go back to them? Why didn't you put up a fight? Questions and assumptions that are deeply flawed and have left vulnerable people, working class women and girls especially, ignored, voiceless, denied justice. That's why the mission today matters to me. I'm proud of my previous work, proud of my record at the Crown Prosecution Service, but this is personal. Yes, it's Labour's plan to tackle the crime wave gnawing away at our collective sense of security. Of course it is. But it's also unfinished business in my life's work to deliver justice for working people. Justice which, I'm sorry to say, feels quite absent as I look around Britain now. The statistics spell it out. Serious violence rising again. Crime way too high. The charge rate, just 5%, never lower. A recipe for impunity, an invitation for criminals to do whatever they want, swanning around our communities without consequence. And it doesn't stop there. Our courts are backlogged. Victims trapped in a purgatory waiting for the justice that they deserve. Antisocial behaviour is a growing blight. Knife crime, back on the rise, and not just in the inner cities. As you know, it's increased in places like here, in the Potteries as well. And then there's the crime that Jane Clough faced, that women face. Domestic violence, still rife. Sexual offences, higher than ever. Do you know, today, 300 women in Britain will be raped. But of those 300 rapes, just 3 cases will see someone charged. Do you know, I got my team to check those figures because I couldn't believe them. But this is Britain right now. Yet, from the government, silence. No urgency, no reform, no big agenda, nothing. I could say it's the usual Tory sticking plaster politics, and it is. But this is complacency on another level. It's like they can't see the Britain that they've created. Maybe that's it. Their kids don't go to the same schools. Nobody fly tips on their streets. The threat of violence doesn't stalk their communities. They don't see the problems. And so they're complacent about the need for solution, asking outdated questions, making flawed assumptions about victims, policing, crime, about everything. Out of touch with the realities of modern Britain. They should try and walk in your shoes for a day or two. Come speak to the teenage girls here at the college in Stoke-on-Trent who told me they're afraid to walk down their high street in broad daylight because they know they'll get harassed. Or the women's refuge I visited in Birmingham and see the bruises not just on the arms and bodies but in the souls of the women I met there. The family that wrote to me, hiding, terrified that their father will come back to hurt them again, waiting since 2018 for their day in court. This is the Britain they've created, and they should look it in the eye. Working people don't feel safe. I won't take lectures from them on this. I won't have our commitment to justice called into question. And I won't stop until working people feel protected. This is our mission. Labour will make Britain's streets safe. And we will do so, as with all our missions, by bringing people together with purpose and intent, by embracing the challenge that comes with clear accountability, and setting out 4 clear, measurable goals. 1, as I announced on Tuesday, we will restore confidence in every police force to its highest ever level. 2, we will halve incidents of knife crime. 3, we will reverse the collapse in the proportion of crime solved. And 4, by solving more crime, by reducing the number of victims who drop out of the system, we will halve the levels of violence against women and girls. None of this will be easy, clearly. As I've always said, our mission should invite a sharp intake of breath. But after this week, nobody can doubt the scale of our ambition, nor its urgency, or, for that matter, how comprehensively the Tories have thrown in the towel. But equally, it's obvious that these targets require partnerships, not just across government, but between politics and people. It's not just about the police and criminal justice systems. It's about education, media, health, community services, online regulation. Tackling the evils our young boys are exposed to, that follow them in their pockets everywhere that they go. So yes, change has to come from all of us. It is going to be a long, hard road. But there are some steps we need to take together now, urgent priorities that my Labour government would respond to immediately. So let me take each of our targets one by one, starting, as I did on Tuesday, with confidence in the police. Because the horror of what we've seen reported about the Metropolitan Police this week cannot be understated. I know there are good officers in the Met, as of course there are across the whole country. But the actions of that force collectively and individually have tarnished the reputation of policing everywhere. Our policing by consent model, a precious model, is now hanging by a thread. And look, the confidence levels in police across the country are on a downward trend as well. Nearly every person I meet has at least one story, an interaction with the police where something wasn't followed up, calls unanswered, opportunities to share evidence missed. And so people give up. They stop bothering. Crime becomes decriminalised. Now, as Louise Casey pointed out, austerity has had a pernicious effect. I ran the Crown Prosecution Service in the early days of austerity. I had a front row seat for the chaos, the lack of planning and vision which came with the cuts. And I accept, like every public service, the police have been failed by this government. But you always must have a plan. You've got to find a way to modernise, got to keep up with the way crime is changing, retain a visible presence on our streets. And there can never be any defence for the institutional failings, the racism, misogyny and homophobia that we've seen in the Met. That's why our mission will focus on confidence. It will push us to do the hard yards, to tackle the wider sense of impunity in society, unblock our courts, and lower crime meaningfully without perverse incentives on charge or prosecution rates. Confidence is everything. It's what effective, visible, open-minded policing can provide for the communities that it serves. And as we've seen this week, it's what bad policing destroys. So let me be very clear, the next Labour government will modernise British policing. We will raise standards, overhaul training, modernise misconduct and vetting procedures. We will root out institutional discrimination wherever we find it. I've seen what is possible with the police service of Northern Ireland. I had a hand in it. And that word, service, that captures what needs to be done. Policing must change, must start thinking of itself as a public service, must stand with communities, not above them, respect their values. Because if we can get Catholics to serve in Northern Ireland, integrate nationalist communities there into policing, then there can be no justification for any special pleading from the Met in London or any police force. Policing must start to serve women and minorities. No more excuses. And look, modernising the police is also the first step we need to take on halving violence against women and girls. You can't defeat misogyny without robust policing. But you can't have robust policing without defeating misogyny. That's what modern policing looks like, what serving your community looks like. So we'll put specialist domestic abuse workers in the control rooms of every police force, responding to 999 calls, supporting victims of abuse. We'll get a specialist rape unit in every police force. And we'll also set up dedicated rape courts. The current prosecution rates are a disgrace. We all know how hard it is for women to come forward. That the criminal justice system only ever sees the tip of the iceberg on sexual violence. And that the experience of going to court, the way victims are treated, just doesn't work. I've been pushing for action on this for nearly 10 years. In 2014, I spent 9 months with Doreen Lawrence taking evidence and testimony from victims. In 2016, I wrote a private members' victims bill which had cross-party support. The only reason it's not on the statute book is that we don't have a government capable of looking this problem in the eye. But mark my words, a Labour government is coming, and we will bring forward a proper victims' law. And something else that Louise Casey made crystal clear is crucial to restoring confidence: visible neighbourhood policing. We need reform to get more police on the beat, fighting the virus that is antisocial behaviour, fly tipping, off-road biking in rural areas, drugs. Now, some people call this low level. I do not want to hear those words. There's a family in my constituency. Every night, cannabis smoke creeps in from the street outstairs into their children's bedroom, aged 4 and 6. That's not low level. It's ruining their lives. So we won't pull any punches on this. Everyone protected, everyone respected. That's what justice means. And the Tories are soft on it. Soft on antisocial behaviour. Soft on the crime that most affects working class communities. Only Labour will protect them. We'll get 13,000 extra police on our streets. Bring in new respect orders, antisocial behaviour orders with teeth. And we'll get clever with fixed penalty notices. If you want to commit vandalism or dump your rubbish on our streets, then you'd better be prepared to clear up your mess. Because with Labour in power, that's exactly what you'll be doing. Cleaner streets are safer streets. But the reality of today's society, as any parent knows, is that our children need protecting in their homes as well as on their streets. You can't fight behaviour that is learned online, spread online, glorified online, armed only with the tools of the past. Take knife crime. We know so much of this is about prevention, about pulling young boys back before they get in too deep. It's about good youth work, neighbourhood policing, mental health support in every school. We'll do all that. It's about smart legislation as well, about making the criminal exploitation of children illegal and using that to target the county line gangs who exploit kids to do their dirty work. But it's also about standing up to the big tech companies. Seriously, how can we ignore the fact a child can go onto the internet and buy a machete as easily as a football? It's exactly the same thing with social media algorithms that bombard young minds with misogyny. Both are social evils, both an example of where greed comes over good. So my message to the big tech companies is this: the free ride is over. If you make money from the sale of weapons or the radicalisation of people online, then we will find ways to make you accountable. You wouldn't get away with it on the streets, and you won't get away with it online. But look, the fight against online hate shows the scale of the challenge that we face. As I've said before about all our missions, change must come from all of us. Success depends on unlocking the pride and purpose that's in every community. This is a new way of governing, but it can be done. From my experience in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, I draw strength from the unbelievable campaigners I've met, from my friends Doreen Lawrence, the Cloughs, Mina Smallman, and more. I draw inspiration. And from the people of this country, communities like this, I draw belief. Change can happen, and it can happen quickly. People forget, it was only in the 1980s when the physical punishment of children in schools was banned, and a huge cultural change has followed. So why can't we imagine a society where violence against women is stamped out everywhere? Why can't future citizens of our country look back at this generation as the one which turned the page on misogyny, which protected our children and made our streets safe? I promise you this, if we pull together, we can do this. And I will give it everything, because this mission, crime and justice, is my life's work. I've made it central to my Labour Party, because it's central to the lives of working people, for the confidence they need in their community, to push on and hope for a better future, the foundation for a better Britain, where working people succeed, aspiration is rewarded, children are protected, and crime is punished. A Britain where families once again feel safe on their streets. The basis for a country that gets its hope, its future, and its confidence back. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. We're now going to take some questions from the media, and I've got a list of those that are here, I hope, starting with Liz from Sky. Liz.
Hello, yes, thank you very much. The first thing I would like to ask you about is your tax return. We saw the Prime Minister's yesterday. When are we going to see yours? Are you going to publish a summary? Are you going to publish it in full? And what do you make of him paying an effective rate of 22%? Is that reasonable, or does that mean that the system should be overhauled? And very quickly, if you don't mind, just a short one. Sue Gray, if she is found to have broken the Civil Service Code because of conversations that she had with you, are you still going to hire her?
Thank you very much. Let me deal with the question of my tax returns. Now the Prime Minister's published his, I'll publish mine. I hope to be able to do that later on today, so that's very, very straightforward. I'm glad the Prime Minister has published his tax returns. I think that's the right thing to do. Others will obviously analyse those returns. But I do think there's a wider point about choices here, and I'd say this before or after he published his tax returns, which is the choices they make on tax and the tax system are obvious. They always go after working people. You know, if you look at the last 12 months, 18 months in particular, they always go after working people. So, in relation to Sue Gray, I don't have a shadow of doubt that she's acted properly in everything that she has done. Thank you very much, Liz. I think we go next to Charlotte at LBC.
Hello, Charlotte Lynch from LBC here. I know you've spoke about police recruitment before, but we've seen police federations and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, warn about staff retention. Yes, staff are being recruited, but their inexperienced and training's difficult without funding and adequate resources. Would you give the police a pay rise? Can you talk some more about how you would halve incidents of knife crime? We've seen in Northern England as well a recent spate of fatal knife incidents involving teenagers. Would you put police officers on the school gates to tackle this? And also, in your role as leader of the Labour Party, was it essential for you, for work purposes, to have a drink with your staff and thank them to boost morale during lockdown?
Thank you. We are breaking the habit of one question per outlet, aren't we? Not just two, but three in there. Just look, on the question of, retention is a very serious issue and has to be taken seriously. It's why what Louise Casey said was so important. And I was very struck by the fact that quite a lot of the evidence that she collected was actually from police officers themselves, a cry, if you like, from them for the change that they need. And obviously, whatever we do in relation to public sector pay will be fully costed and set out before we go into the election. But what I would say on that, and I think Louise Casey made this point, which is if you look at some of the examples that are listed of the behaviour that she criticises in the report, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to say that's got to do with pay. That's to do with culture, behaviour, attitudes and leadership. And for my part, far too often with reports like this, we try to find, as it were, a quick and easy answer without doing the hard yards of the change that's desperately needed. That will take leadership. It will require an iron will. So far as fatal knife incidents are concerned, obviously this is central to our mission. Knife crime is pernicious. Knife crime causes awful impacts on victims and their families, and it causes young people to feel unsafe in their own streets, whether or not they're actually subject to an incident of knife crime. So this is at the heart of youth safety. I do think more work needs to be done in and around schools. I do think more work needs to be done on our streets. That's why our commitment to 13,000 more officers actually in our communities working on a neighbourhood basis is so important, and also why our commitment to tackle the acquisition of knives online is so important. It should not be possible for a young person to get a knife as easily as they get a football online. In relation to, I mean, I'm not going to comment overly on the evidence that the former Prime Minister gave yesterday. There's been plenty of commentary already. But all I can say is we did not have leaving parties, and the committee must now be left to decide for itself what it makes of the evidence that he has given them. Thank you very much. Sophie from the Mirror.
Hi, so my question's on crime prevention. In 2021, 6 children were stabbed to death in Croydon. All of the perpetrators and victims involved had been excluded from school. Of the prison population, 42% were expelled or permanently excluded from school. If Labour is serious about tackling the causes of crime, will you commit to banning school exclusions except for the most extreme circumstances?
Well, Sophie, thank you for raising this, because I've obviously been looking at this for a very long time. And if you look at the likelihood of a young person ending up in prison, then the indicators that are most significant are difficulties at primary school and excluded at secondary school. And that's why it's very important that if we're going to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, you've heard that before and you'll hear it again because it's central to everything that is the Labour Party. By the way, that's not me just picking up on a phrase that we've used before. Tough on crime, tough on the cause of crime has been something I've been living for decades in my own personal and professional life. But if you're going to do that, you have to put your prevention into your schools. On the question of exclusion, I think that is an important consideration. But what I've focused on today, which I do think is vitally important, is mental health support in each of our schools. There are, young people who clearly need support in our schools, mental health support, and they're not getting it. And I think that needs to be in every school. So thank you very much for that, Sophie. I've got Richard, please, from the Stoke Sentinel. Richard.
Hi. Jonathan Gullis, the Tory Member of Parliament for this area.
I do know him.
He caused a bit of infamy not so long ago, describing people who fly tip, carry out antisocial behaviour and do drugs in alleyways, that kind of thing. He described them as scumbags, scroats and such like. Do you agree? And linked to that, there's a feeling in this area that Boris Johnson's kind of personal appeal is something that won the 3 Tory members of Parliament in Stoke-on-Trent their seats at the last election. Does your personal appeal carry through with voters in the same way? And do you feel that will you be relying on, kind of voters not being as enamoured with Rishi Sunak perhaps as they were with Boris Johnson in order to win you those seats? Well,
look, in relation to the second part of your question, there's a very quick way to find out. We could have a general election. We've got very good candidates, including around here, to replace some of those candidates and MPs that are there. on your point about antisocial behaviour and the comments, Jonathan, firstly, antisocial behaviour is really serious and fly tipping is really serious. But I don't think, I mean, I wouldn't use language like that. I don't think that's appropriate language to use. But also, more deeply, I think he's just wrong to use language and not action. I think anybody in his constituency... I think his constituents say stop using language which is disrespectful and just trying to gain attention and do something about it. And that's why what we announced today is so important in relation to effective action and sanctions with teeth. That means that, you know, if you fly tip under a Labour government, you'll be clearing it up. And that's what should be happening. And, you know, I'm afraid after 13 years, to hear Tory MPs going around saying things are pretty awful around here is a bit rich. As if they just come down from the moon and say, what's going on? You've been in power for 13 years. That's what's going on. Thank you, Richard. Chloe at the Eye. Chloe.
Thank you. You said that you don't think it's the right time to disband the Met, but are there any circumstances in which you could see yourself overhauling the structure of the force? And just on violence against women, what would you do to actually tackle the culture behind the violence and sexual crimes?
On the structure, on the structure of the... Chloe, I think this is about behavioural change, cultural change, and about leadership. And I say that because I worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years with the Police Service of Northern Ireland, who were transforming from the Royal Ulster Constabulary. I could see that, yes, you could change personnel and structures, but what you needed to change most of all was behaviours, culture, and that's much, much, much more difficult. I think that something on the scale of what happened in Northern Ireland with the Police Service of Northern Ireland is now what's needed in the Met. I resist the sort of structural, break it up, heads must roll model, because I've seen that too often before, where when something goes wrong, there's a sort of tendency to say, well, as long as one person goes, then the problem is solved. I've never really believed that that actually solves the problem. And having looked at Louise Case's findings, I don't think that will be enough in relation to the Met. So actually, it's not that structure is, you know, the ultimate change. I actually think the ultimate change is the behavioural, cultural change, and I think that's much, much harder. I want to back the Commissioner in the action he's taking, but I want him to go further, and he knows that we want him to go further. Thank you, Chloe. Tom, please, from GB News.
Thank you. The Prime Minister's tax returns date back to all of his time in Cabinet. Will you be publishing your tax returns for all of your time in Shadow Cabinet? And just on today's announcements, you're pledging more police, more resources and very tough targets. How are you going to fund all of this? Might it include raising capital gains tax? Yes or no?
Tom, on the, I mean, I'll hopefully publish my accounts later on today, so you'll see them in due course. In relation to the funding within the police, firstly, let me deal with the funding that we've already allocated, which is the 13,000 new officers. We've set out that that will come from the waste, frankly, that is there in the resourcing and procurement across the various forces. And so there are all sorts of inefficiencies. I saw these for myself. Yvette Cooper's analysed them. So we can fund that from within. But there are other funding commitments that we've already made in relation to the non-dom status, in relation to the VAT exemption for schools. So wherever we've made a commitment, we've set out in terms how we would pay for it. And that's the way we'll continue to do this. I just want to add one thing, Tom, because it is really important. And that is that, yes, funding and money is always important when it comes to any public service, including the police. But reform is also important. I saw this when I was running, the prosecution service. We needed to reform. I've already said it about the National Health Service. Again, you could say the National Health Service needs more money. But again, with every public service, you can put more money in the top. But if you really want to change the outputs, then it's reform as well. And that's why what I've said today is a lot about the reform of police and confidence in policing, as well as the money element. Thank you very much, Tom. Jack from The Sun. Jack.
Thank you, Sir Keir. We've learned today that dangerous foreign criminals went on to commit even more awful crimes after you campaigned to stop them being deported just 3 years ago. Do you now regret that, and would you like to say sorry to their victims?
Well, Jack, look, what I would say is this, that I think most people are fed up to the back teeth with a government that is seeking to blame everybody else but themselves for the problems in relation to crime. If there's a problem with confidence in policing, and there is, then ask ourselves who broke it. If there's a problem with our criminal justice system, and there is, then ask yourself who broke it. If there's a problem with our asylum and deportation system, then ask yourself who broke it. And frankly, for a government, 13 years into power, to cast around and blame people, anybody else but themselves, for what's going on, shows just how desperate they are. I'm afraid it's casting around. You can't blame the opposition for the government's failures. I'm sorry about that, but it is a rule in politics. Amy from The Telegraph. Amy.
Thank you. So, Keir, just another question on tax, if I may. So some of your MPs have suggested the Prime Minister paying 22% tax is unfair. Would you consider taxing wealth at the same rate as income? And then secondly, how would you respond to claims that your pension arrangements are hypocritical? And how would you defend holding a pension pot that is exempt from the lifetime tax-free cap you are seeking to impose on others?
Look, Amy, in relation to tax, obviously, we'll set out our position as we go into an election. I think others will analyse the Prime Minister's financial details. They're there for all to see. In the end, that goes back to the point I made about the choices that are made. When this government has had to raise taxes, it's always gone for the same people, which is working people. And I think that's now writ large in relation to what we've seen in the last 24 hours. In relation to my pension scheme, I mean, let me just take that head on, if I may. Firstly, it was a government pension scheme put in place for DPPs. So that's why it was a statutory instrument. It's a government-run scheme. I'm absolutely committed to changing what the government did last week, which was to give a tax cut to the wealthiest 1%. Now, by the way, we're also committed to reversing non-doms. But let me go further than that. I don't intend that to exclude me, and therefore haven't taken advantage of this. There's no tax advantage, nor do I want one. So when we reverse that change the government put in place last week, I will be included within that. Whatever change is needed within legislation or anything else, I'm very happy, want to be and will be in the same position as everybody else in this country. So I'll be very, very clear about that. Michael from The Express. Michael.
Thank you, Sir Keir. On attitudes within the Crown Prosecution Service, do you think prosecutors are willing to take on enough cases? Do you think they should be trying to prosecute more rapists?
Look, I know how hard prosecutors work and the police work, and this is difficult work. I do want to see the charge rate go up in relation to prosecutions for violence against women and girls. I was shocked, I think everybody should be shocked, to learn that the charge rate for reported rapes is 1.6%. Over 98% don't go to court. 98% of rapists don't go to court. Reported cases. So do I want to drive that up? You bet I do. Absolutely bet I do. And that's why I've got brilliant people on my front bench and shadow cabinet will work with me in government to make sure we drive that rate up. It cannot be right that over 98% of rapists are never put before a court. And I don't care what else the government says. That is a shameful record. And they should be rolling up their sleeves and doing something about it instead of casting around, as they always do, saying it's somebody else's fault, everything is okay. Yes, the answer is we will drive that rate up. It is central to what we want to do, which is to halve the incidence of violence against women and girls. Thank you so much for raising that. Jess.
Hi there. Sir Keir, if someone you loved was assaulted in London, would you feel confident that when they reported it to the Metropolitan Police that they would get the best possible recourse to justice? Because Louise Casey says no, and I wonder if you agree with her. And secondly, there's some news out today about the College of Policing and their advice on charging, that potentially those who are charged or arrested shouldn't be named, or it should be optional for police forces to name them. Obviously, with the case of David Carrick, the naming of him was one of the things that prompted a lot of victims to come forward. So do you have concerns about that?
Well, look, Jess, nobody reading the Casey report would be other than concerned about what is illuminated in her report. But I do get asked this question. Would I advise my friends, in due course, they're a bit younger, my children, to go to the Metropolitan Police if something happened to them? And the answer to that is yes, I would. I absolutely would. And I think it's very important that I say that. There are very good officers in the Met, and I would want my children and my friends to have the confidence to go forward and report. And I say that without any ambiguity at all. On the separate issue of naming those that are charged, the answer is it's complicated. And I don't shy away from this. There are very good reasons why you shouldn't in a number of cases, and that's the norm. But there are too many examples where a perpetrator has not faced justice or faced full justice because there hasn't been any naming. And we've seen a number of cases where once it's clear an individual has been identified, other people come forward. It's got to be a judgment call. It is very difficult. You can almost bet that whatever the judgment call is, people will criticise it. But I'm afraid I don't agree with the blanket rule either way. I do think there's got to be flexibility. And I think if we don't have that, we will actually have a system that doesn't work as well as it could. Thank you, Jess. I've got Ryan from the Mail.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on the question from my colleague at The Sun, you say today you want to stop criminals getting away without punishment, but how can people take you seriously with your history of having campaigned to prevent dangerous criminals from being deported who then go on to commit further offences, violent offences? And secondly, could I just ask, please, are you still committed to updating the Gender Recognition Act to allow self-identification for trans people? Thank you.
Ryan, how can anybody... look, people can have confidence in me taking crime seriously and prosecuting and convicting criminals, because I did it for a living. For 5 years, I headed up the Crown Prosecution Service, 7,000 staff across England and Wales with 100 offices, prosecuting the best part of 1 million cases year on year on year on year. And that included rape and counter-terrorism, people smuggling, drugs, you name it, along with some of the issues like antisocial behaviour, theft and burglary as well. So, Ryan, I say, and that's why I said in my speech, I'm proud of my record. I devoted 5 years of my life to prosecuting criminals. I worked with the police service in Northern Ireland, not directly prosecuting criminals, but to ensure that they had the confidence of their communities that they could fight crime as well. So there's a decade of work. Countless rapists were prosecuted under my watch. Countless terrorists were prosecuted under my watch. So I stand on my record. I stand proudly on my record. Ryan, the second part of your question was, I'm sorry, I've just... yeah, look, I mean, I think that if we reflect on what's happened in Scotland, the lesson I take from that is that if you're going to make reforms, you have to carry the public with you. And I think that's a very important message. And I think that's why it's clear that in Scotland there should be a reset of the situation. Thank you. And Richard from PA. Richard.
Hi, Sir Keir, thank you very much. It's a broad strategy you've set out. I just wonder about those other frontline services who often find themselves in a thankless position. Probation services, social services, and acute mental health community services. We've got a shocking lack of critical care mental health beds out there. Will there be more resources for those people who often find themselves criticised in the reports after cases like Arthur Lavinia Hughes' death, but with nothing further done, no more money, difficulty in retaining good staff, and all the problems that go with it. What will Labour do about that if they were in government?
Yeah, Richard, thank you for raising that, because it's a really important point. One of my frustrations when I was running the prosecution service within criminal justice was that it felt like it was in a silo, separate from social services, from education, from mental health, from health, when, in truth, for very many cases that I saw, there was always an opportunity where action could have been taken in other departments that supported or helped reduce crime. So, Richard, the first part of the answer is that, and I said it in my speech, this has to be something which is done across different departments. This cannot be done in one place. There is a mental health, a schooling and education element to so many of the offences that come before our courts and end up in our prisons. We need to acknowledge that. That's why we want to be very tough on criminals getting caught, tough on criminals being charged, tough on criminals going to prison and having tough sentences, but equally tough on the work that needs to be done in our communities, in our schools, in our education, in our mental health, to prevent and protect in the first place. Now, that isn't, Richard, all about budgets, and I'm not going to set out budgets now. I'm obviously aware of the pressure there is down on all of those departments. It is a different way of working, and we need to break out of the way that this has been operating for a very long time now. Thank you, Richard. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.